Welcome to Behavioral Grooves. My name is Kurt Nelson.
And I'm Tim Houlihan. Given the strange and turbulent times that we are living through, Kurt and I decided to reach out to some of our favorite behavioral science researchers and practitioners to get their take on the novel coronavirus pandemic that is shaking the world.
These special edition episodes will explore a variety of different aspects of the crisis and our response to each of those aspects through a behavioral lens.
We know that you may feel overwhelmed by the crisis already. It seems every news story, every social media thread, every phone conversation that we have is focused on some aspect of the pandemic right now. While the news and updated information are essential, we're going to take a different tack. We want to try to understand the science behind our reactions and our behaviors and how science can help us cope and move beyond the current crisis.
In each episode, we talk with a different behavioral science expert and get their best thinking on an aspect of the crisis. So sit back, take a deep breath, and listen to our special series on behavioral science and the coronavirus pandemic. Welcome to Behavioral Grooves. Today, with our special edition, we have James Brewer, who is the Director of Marketing Platforms, Global Custom Operations for Eli Lilly and Company. James held many jobs prior to this, including Director of Commercial Operations, where Tim and I had the opportunity to work with him on applying behavioral science insights into the company. James is one of our behavioral science practitioner and also a friend. He was also one of the very first people we interviewed for Behavior Grooves, showing up in episode 6. So welcome back to the show, James.
Hey, appreciate it. Good to see you both.
We are glad you're here.
Yeah, we are. So, James, we're going to ask you a few questions on this topic, but I also know that you wanted to ask us a few questions. So we'll see how this plays out as we go along. But to begin with, I just wanted to ask you about how your views have shifted. We were talking the other day, and you brought up what I thought was an interesting insight, that up until a few weeks ago, you really didn't take the threat from the coronavirus very seriously. So help me understand how do you change your mind? What happened that made that switch?
Well, I think obviously it's a learning curve. Anytime you're introduced to something new, you start from one point and you have a choice. Am I going to continue to investigate and learn and be willing to change your stance? That's called learning. And when you go through a learning process, it means that you're in a place where you might be wrong. And that was the first step. And where I was exposed to it, just like most Americans, is we heard something happening over in China. We heard they were shutting down and quarantine. And I'm like, okay, well, it spreads, and it's going to really be a risk to the older population. But in general, it's just basically a view of it's like the flu, and we've survived the flu. And I was putting the numbers of the flu together, and I think here in the United States, we can have millions and millions of people infected, and we actually have tens of thousands that pass away each and every year from not in the 2,000, 3,000, but in the range of 20, 30, 40, 50,000 deaths. And I'm like, we can manage this. This is something we've done before. But what changed is understanding and listening to, in particular, this latency period. This period where you could be infected and not know it and not have symptoms. And that's distinctly different than the flu. Many times we get the flu, and within that 24, 48 hours, you start feeling it. You recluse yourself. You might be in bed. And you do it because you just don't feel like being social. This one, you're infected. Number one, you don't know it. And all of a sudden, you start connecting. And there was this visual dot simulation you might have seen that was posted out on LinkedIn. I saw it on Facebook, and it's been reposted. But it's an actual simulation of different scenarios of one is a full quarantine, one social distancing, one's not doing anything. I can't remember the fourth one. But the simulation runs multiple different ways. It doesn't ever come out it doesn't go through the process the same way because it's an AI driven. The solutions on the back end look very similar, and that is a wide population is going to get it regardless. And there's different ways we can take this virus on and eradicate it in the safest manner, in the social distancing that. And when I saw that, probably about 2.5 weeks ago, it started changing my mind. Like, wait a minute, this is going to influence and impact us. And simultaneously, that 14-day latency period where we don't know it, is where it's going to spread very rapidly.
Yeah.
And those two pieces, one was the visualization that someone had put together along with this latency, really sort of connected us saying, okay, this one's a bit different.
Yeah. I think there's a piece of this that you talked about this earlier where you thought about it as the flu. And I think a lot of the conversation that people had early on in this, it was related to the flu. And that's kind of a similar thing when you have what we call these black swan experiences, where these experiences that are highly impactful, but very rare do they happen. So we don't even have a language around them to be able to describe them.
Correct. Right.
And so what happens is we try to associate them with things that we are familiar with and know. And so, and some people claim, oh, there was malicious intent on some of that. And we're not going to go there. But the idea is that, we just have a hard time. Behavioral science, our brains aren't necessarily wired to be able to extrapolate all of the information that is coming in that is new and how significant this is, along with other variety of other things. So we have to compare it to something, and the things we compare it to are those things that we're really familiar with, which may not be a good representation of what is actually happening.
That's right. We go back to what we think we know. And then at some point when you get exposed to new information, the dots don't connect and validate what you know. That's where you have to sit there and go, and you have two choices, really. One is, I'm going to stick with what I know, even though I'm going to be in a state of ignorance. I don't mind being in a state of ignorance as long as I open the door and say, I don't want to be ignorant anymore. And that's what transpired about 2.5, 3 weeks ago. Being called ignorant is very different. We associate ignorance and stupidity. I think choosing to be ignorant and not educating, you move yourself quickly in stupidity. If you're ignorant and willing to learn, you've opened the door and you've exposed yourself to an opportunity that will, quite frankly, in this scenario, maybe make yourself, more importantly, our communities, starting with our families, our communities, and then broader right now, the globe. In fact, it's really fascinating. I don't want to go too far on this, but if I have to say, one of the most powerful things I've seen in this in a positive light, and I've heard this said many times, so it's not unique to me, and I'm talking about some of our leaders, I'm seeing different sides of what I would call them politics, but a different size of policy owners coming together. And finally, just in the last few days, I'm seeing very divergent views on many other topics coming together and saying, you know what, we're in this. We've got to start working together, regardless of our policy difference, regardless of this one. We have a common threat. The humanity does right now. Put everything else aside. We've got to come together, hold hands, distance. Bad analogy. But we have to come together and start working together. And I saw the mayor of New York, the mayor of San Francisco, actually acknowledge working closely with the White House. And those two city mayors are very divergent on most policies with the current White House, but on this topic, they're working together. And we as American people and the world, quite frankly, need to see that to have any confidence when we get through this and we're moving from the state of ignorance into learning. So while it's happening to me at an individual level, I'm also seeing this starting to happen in what I would call policymakers or our leaders, regardless if we want them to be our leaders. We'll step that one aside. And I mean on both sides of the aisle, right?
Oh, I know.
And I'm just saying, when you start seeing people working together, like, okay, you're putting your differences aside. This one is a common battle. And I've started hearing this term. Humanity has a common threat, and we have a global war going on. And that means people are starting to go through, I want to move from ignorance. I want to go to, and I'm talking not everybody, but the general populace of leaders are saying we need to start being collaborative.
So, James, I want to go back to this really beautiful way you were talking about moving from open ignorance to saying, I want to learn. It sounds like there was a curiosity. So how much of your own transformation in thinking about this was something that you felt came from inside, sort of a self-motivation, versus how much came from, really kind of the everybody's talking about it, everybody's doing it this way, I guess I better conform?
Well, I think there I think they both happened, and and I can't tell you which happened first, but let me just share with you. On a personal note, you may or may not know it, my wife is a physician. And so we started having these conversations. And she herself, actually, with her deep knowledge of the classic flu and things of that nature, was saying, you know what? Are we overreacting? This was 3 weeks ago, and she was looking at the numbers from a flu perspective, and she goes, maybe we're just not familiar with, say, just the common flu. And if we were familiar with it, maybe we'd be doing the same things with the flu. And we were going back and forth, and we said, well, what's unique about this? And so part of it, she started going down her deep understanding. She did went back over 100 years looking at CDC reports all the way back to the Spanish flu. And she started looking at how they're spread. And so here on a medical side, she's doing that deep dive. So I had a little bit of insight there. Of course, I don't have that same level of medical knowledge she does. So I went another way and started researching the best I could. And that's, from different, quite frankly, Googling it, from hitting on LinkedIn, finding different responses. That's what was happening, what I was saying on a personal note. And then simultaneously, our company a week ago, this past Monday, so we're in our second week, our corporate Eli Lilly said, all of you, go home. You're not to be at work anymore. The only people at work were those that are critical to core, our research scientists, our distribution teams, and our manufacturing, because Eli Lilly manufactures, produces research medicines that we, the society, not in the United States, but worldwide, need, from our diabetes all the way over to our cancer, life-threatening, and indeed, even our research scientists have partnered, and over the last 3 weeks have jumped in to try to find a cure, or at least something that can help medically with the COVID. So that was the external. I'm like, okay, if my organization, who comes from a very deep scientific background, if they're making that, and I have to tell you, I was still starting on that path. Remember, learning is not just, oh, I'm willing to learn, and therefore you adopt all the knowledge. It's a continuation. My first reaction when I heard that happening, announcement, I'm like, what are they doing? Because immediately I started thinking, are they really just trying to shift the legal response of me getting sick away from to me personally? And I actually raised that to we have a leadership team, and I raised that openly because I feel very safe in the environment that I work. I can raise questions without ridicule. And so we have a learning environment, and that's a big shift in our culture over the last 10 years. And I think it's a good, positive move that Lilly's continuing to make. And my supervisor looked at me, and we were on conference call, but he said, James, it's a fair question, but here's the reality. We're trying to minimize the risk for our core operators. So if you think of a workplace downtown Indianapolis, Indiana, with over 12,000 employees, and I don't know the exact numbers, but bear with me. Let's say 3,000 are core to the research, manufacturing, distribution. We want them as safe as possible, remove the rest of us so we reduce the potential risk. They then put in multiple. This wasn't about shifting prior. This is about those that we need to continue to do core operations need to have, in essence, corporate distancing from the mass of us that would possibly bring in. Now, here's an interesting outcome. I just had a conference call with leadership across the globe with Eli Lilly. Our speaker was our CEO, our senior vice president of HR, and our doctor that's leading all health services. And they had a call, open, transparent, and they shared something. Out of the 40,000 employees worldwide at this present time, as of today, we only have 4 employees infected with COVID. Now, no one thinks that's going to be stable, by no means, but that gives you an example that we reacted 2 weeks ago by doing the social distancing. And it wasn't just leave the place of work, apply that in your own lives.
Yeah.
And I think that's what people have, and they've been recommitted in multiple messages. It's not just Eli Lilly social distancing. Do the social distancing within your own family and your own communities.
Yeah. So, James, I remember talking to you when we were working on incentives, and we talked a lot about unintended consequences. And
yes.
So there are, factors when we're putting incentives together that sometimes play out where we think it's going to drive these behaviors, but there are some unintended behaviors or consequences as a result of the plan that we put in. One of the things that we talked about the other day when we were on the phone, but also I think that is just in coming out with this, is that there are probably going to be some unintended consequences from the actions that are going on. Some may be positive unintended consequences. Many of them might be not so positive unintended consequences.
Correct.
Wondering if you have any thought on, again, some of the things that maybe you've seen and taking that perspective of looking at this from potential unintended consequences, because that's what we had to try to do with incentives, because you can't really fully understand until you do a look back, but you always try to understand, like, well, what could happen here if we do this, right? How are people going to try to game the system? What do you think are some of the potential unintended consequences of all the reactions and the way that things have been handled?
Yeah, well, first off, I do remember those conversations. I remember the first time you introduced that. We had run a program and we had 2 or 3 objectives and we hit those 2 or 3. And I was sort of ecstatic because it was something we had tried to learn how to do. And that's why we partnered almost 10 years ago, I think it was now. And I'm like, why are you asking that? We achieved what we set up the objectives. We had those, we hit them. And you're like, James, you realize, and you explained what you just said, anytime you do something, there's also a negative. We need to reevaluate and said, okay, we achieved that's great, but let's do an after act. What else happened that we can see that was not expected? So in this scenario, so that again was that learning of saying there's pros and cons here, what's going on. I think the biggest thing that has really, really been an unintended, and it's not lost on anyone, but it's real, and that is the shutting down of the service industry that we're so reliant on. Mm-hmm. Is not only now, but will be for the next 30, 60, 90 days, devastating for our communities, for individuals, for families. Probably every one of us has either a personal friend or family, and I'm not just talking food service. I'm talking the airlines, the cruise lines, the food services, the bars, all of those. That has been absolutely a whole stop shutdown immediately overnight. And these are a segment of our population. And we can say, oh, it's 5 or 10%. I disagree, because the ripple effect, I was thinking through this, I was recognizing that these places, even that they're doing carry out, they're at 1/3 or 1/10 of their staffing. And all of a sudden, and their revenue is going to be coming down immediately. Now, all of a sudden, the rent space, that may not be able to take care of rent. And then that real estate guy or person, I should say, that owns the building, maybe they're going to have a ripple effect. So this untold that the restaurant can't pay the rent. Well, then the owner, and we all know these occupancies make a living. The people that own, we say, oh, they're rich, they can handle it. Maybe they can't because they have a larger bill that they have to pay. And so it's this unintended consequence of immediately the frontline employees, and what are they going to do? And I can tell you their stress level has to be off the chart. How am I going to feed my family? How am I going to pay my gas bills, my electric bills, all those daily things? Because I'm living paycheck to paycheck. And that may or may not be a fault of their own. I'm not trying to go to that. It's just a fact of reality. And all of a sudden they've got maybe, and some of these places are saying you have 2 weeks severance. That's it. We have one more check for you. And they're going, I can survive 2 weeks. Well, here we are. And in fact, I was talking to the general manager of one restaurant, and he said, James, probably the scariest thing is good news, bad news. My wife just called me, and we had to re-roof our house, and it was at a very large expense. And we took our cash savings and did that. And then this hit. I don't have emergency funds anymore. Those are the type of, and that's just one story. How many thousands of millions of people are going to have that same story? The car stopped working. I had $2,000 repair. I had to use my, whatever the case is. We all know those scenarios. And those are some of the unintended consequences. And that's just the start of it.
Yeah. You had talked, I agree with you at the ripple effect of this goes much broader than what we think about. I was talking, or I heard somebody the other day who's a lighting specialist. And you go, all right, lighting specialist. Well, the lighting specialists work in large scale meetings. They're the ones who put up all the lights and different things for your meetings. Well, there's no meetings. You got to think about the sound technicians. You think about, all of the people that work at convention centers and various different things. So that ripple effect keeps moving out and is much larger than just that immediate, airline industry employees, your restaurant, different, these are impacting a much wider swath of the population because of that ripple effect. And then if they don't have any money, they're not going to be spending that, right? So you talked about rental and various different pieces. So that's going to happen and different things. So
yeah. And when is it going to start hitting bigger companies? At what point do companies that are multi-billion-dollar organizations like the size of Eli Lilly, multinationals, the global 500, the global 1,000, eventually they're going to be impacted as well as if this continues to remain as dark and deep as it appears right now?
Well, I'll give you an example of one of the major airline carriers. I don't need to reference it, but it happens to be my sister-in-law works for them. And she had received a week ago the biggest promotion in her career. Ecstatic. It was a competitive job. It moved her into an executive leadership level. And she was ecstatic. The next day, she received a message from her HR that she had 6 weeks left in that job, even though she just got it because of this turn down. And she had 6 weeks. And at the end of 6 weeks, and this is one of the major, you can name the top three. It's one of those three. And she has 6 weeks left. And so it's already happening. I know it's an airline industry, but and so she's like, holy cow, did I just make a mistake? Well, the mistake was her previous job probably would have given her immediate dismissal and gave her 2 to 4 weeks severance. And she has the job for 6 weeks, and then she'll go into the severance only because she moved up one level. So it's already happening to these larger companies.
So what are businesses doing well? And what are they, again, not taking into account and maybe missing at this point? If we start looking out, again, some of those larger organizations, but even some of the smaller, mid-sized companies, and even going back down to mom and pop situations, what is going on that they're getting right, that they're doing the right things? And then what are the things that, again, they're not taking into consideration? Have you thought about that at all? Either of you, by the way.
Yeah, I will say this. I saw some of it. I know by law they had to shut down, but what I saw immediately was it wasn't like, let's skirt around this. So what was doing well, they immediately created action. Restaurants here in Indianapolis were shut down on Tuesday, St. Patty's Day, right? And many of them didn't wait till Tuesday. They shut down on Monday, period. I was up in Indianapolis and everything went down immediately. They didn't wait for the next day. In other words, what did they do well? They're taking this serious. Why? Because they have employees that are at risk. And they did it, and they did it at a financial risk, right? They could have gone one more day, one more meal. No, they said, if that's happening tomorrow, why don't we shut down now? So I think one thing I'm seeing is people are listening, and in the general populace, they're taking it seriously. And I think that's really good. I don't know if I have a good insight yet as to what people aren't, or where companies are not doing things well. If they are, it may be part of that own, as I referenced, they may be going on a learning curve where they're doing what they think is the right thing, and maybe retroactively they may look back and go, ooh, maybe I shouldn't have done that, or maybe I should have. The biggest pain point, again, it goes back to many of these owners are asking people to leave, and they know that in fact, I just heard a discussion with 4 local small business owners out across the East Coast, and every single one of those business owners talked first about their employees and safety, and their heart went out to them because they don't have the resources to take care of their employees. So I think there's first step. I'm seeing more people or businesses doing the right thing. I can't say I've seen someone doing the wrong thing. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't. I just am not aware of that. I see people taking this very serious and creating action. Now, one additional benefit, and this is not intentional to raise the company I work for, but because we're a research scientific company, there's some interesting things that we are doing that I thought was really, really fascinating. Number one, we're partnering around, and this was just shared with our senior leadership today, but we're partnering around the globe with governments because we have really deep expertise in testing. And in fact, Lilly has actually set up one of the first drive-through testing units in the city of Indianapolis with our research scientists and with our capability to actually set up that testing environment. And so that's starting, and it stunned me that they can get results within 2 hours.
Wow.
They can literally do a swab. I shared that with my wife, and she goes, "Okay, that's pretty quick. It's a little bit. They must be swabbing. Apparently, the flu can also be tested very quickly, but there's some similarities there. But I like the resources of the company, and it was first and foremost immediately with a bit of a pilot tested for employees.
Okay.
Moving into in partnership with the Indiana State Health Department to bring that to the larger population. That's a good example of a company taking." A good example of a company taking their resources and applying it to this urgent need. I think that's neat. Additionally, I mentioned this earlier, we've signed, I think it's been 3 weeks ago, with another company, and we're accelerating our research in the fight of this virus. And so that means we've shifted priorities. I'm sure this wasn't on our docket for research, and our CEO said, no, carve this out. We have that expertise. Let's start partnering and getting it going. So, and we're not unique in that, but I think that's where we see good behaviors of a company doing the right thing.
How do you think the crisis will change the way we work?
Short term, I think there's something that's happening for the most of us, and that is short term. In fact, our CEO, Dave Ricks, made this comment. He said, you know what? We're not trying to get back to normal in all things. In fact, this might actually help us learn we're more together than we are apart. Over the last 2 years, we have a construct called Team Lilly. And it's fascinating because it was a cultural, I mean, we had literally, I remember Dave Ricks coming out at a corporate CEO event, and he's in a pair of jeans with a T-shirt that says Team Lilly. And I'm like, are we doing another slogan or is this real? 2 years later. But that's what we have in companies today. Is that a slogan?
It's exactly.
In 2 years, it's still his number one priority. And the reason why is even in large companies where you think, oh, you're all working together. No, we have our oncology department, we have our diabetes, we have our biomeds, I'm in ops, and someone's over here in HR, someone's over in IT, and we've fought for our resources, we have our team, and we work as a small team, but do we really work collaboratively as a large team of 40,000? And Dave Ricks goes, yes, that's the only way we're going to increase productivity and come together. So I actually think what's happening in microcosm of Eli Lilly is happening globally, and that is we're starting to see divisiveness set aside, and we have a common battlefront. And it may be the first time, at least in my lifetime, that I'm seeing people from everywhere around the world going, what's number one on your mind? It's this virus. What can I do? And maybe all I can do is that social distancing with me and my family. I think there's other things that I can do in my community. I'll come back to in a moment. But I do think that's one of the benefits, and I hope that stays, is that we learn when we work collaboratively, we get an opportunity to accelerate outcomes. And I can only, as Dave Ricks said, maybe that's when we get to some state in the future, there's some learnings we don't go back to the norm. And this would be that collaborative team collaboration.
I think you bring up a really good point that because we are forced into some of these new situations, that we have been pushed beyond what we would normally do, that we respond differently and we react differently. And organizations that are smart, that will, as you said, take their ignorance but be open to learning from it.
Yes.
They will be the ones who will be able to say, all right, what did we do in this times of crisis that we did because we had to, but now we can choose to do them because we found out that they were better. It may be attitudinal, it may be cultural, it might be, that Team Lilly thing, it isn't a slogan. It really is this aspect that we have to do. And we need to actually double down on that. It might be ways of saying, wow, we realized how much we needed to be bonding and belonging, and that the social distancing was really, really hard, not being able to be there with other people. So let's make sure that we actually focus on that in times when we just do it naturally, but maybe not purposefully. So I think there are lots of those types of things that we can do. The big issue is, will people and will organizations learn from this, or will, once this crisis kind of passes, things fall back into everyday normal of what it was before, and we don't take the time to reflect back on it? That's my fear.
I think it's a fair fear. I ran across two individuals, probably, I'm guessing, in their 20s. And independently, they both said exactly the same thing. This feels like I'm watching, or I'm inside of a TV show. It doesn't feel real.
Yeah.
My response to him, I said, it's fascinating. I think I understand that. And I mentioned to both of them, I said, you know what? I said, probably your great-grandparents, my grandparents, went through something that was the closest thing in proximity, and it was called World War II. And they got into rationing. They got into corporate, at that time, I'm going to use this term, gender-specific war, where the men went off to battle. The ladies went into the factories. And they weren't making normal goods. They shifted the manufacturing. I don't know if you had the opportunity to watch that TV or the recent movie Ford versus Ferrari. Ford Jr. actually made a reference. He was pointing out at some scene in the movie to his manufacturing. He said, my daddy actually participated in the war by turning this plant into building fighter planes. And he said, we were part of that. And they had to come back in and recognize a change. Now, why is this relevant? Because they're coming out of that. There were some learnings, and there were some. Now, I have to tell you, these two young gentlemen that I talked to, they're not exposed to that. So there was a multi-generation gap in their sense, as well with mine. I'm hoping that out of these type of massive events, and again, I've heard this is not mine. Maybe the closest thing we as a world have done this is that last time we were in a world war. And now the difference between that time and this time, the common item we're fighting isn't another nation or other people. It's a virus, but we collectively. And so that's why this is unique. And hopefully what we do is we walk out of here and reflect, because it wasn't a little blip, right?
Yeah.
It was a massive blip, and it's happening now. And we're only in the beginning stages of it over the next 30, 60, 90 days. And so I cannot imagine this time next year that we're like, oh, yeah, that was just a little thing. No, it's going to change the way we think. It's going to change the way we live. And it's going to actually have an impact on us, I believe, for decades ahead.
Well, let's wrap this up. I think one of the pieces of this, that why you had reached out to us, asked us if we were going to do this, and we started talking in various different pieces of this, but it spurred us to the idea that we actually are going to have this series on this. And so thank you for that, James. We appreciate that. The idea of this, I think, is really to understand, we're not the experts on the epidemic and how the virus spreads in various different pieces. What we want to explore is the human dynamics of this. And so if you had to just think of one thing, one aspect that from a personal perspective that you think this has really highlighted for you, what is that one thing from a, how has it made you feel, or you and your family? What are those aspects from a behavioral perspective that has impacted you most?
I simply think it's connected us in a way, and I'm saying not just the three of us, not just my family, not just my neighbors down the street, but it's connected us human race in a way that Nothing in my lifetime I ever seen the connectivity. I can watch a news article, or I have team members that report to me from around the globe, and I can be on the phone with them. And guess what? We're facing the same thing.
Mm.
Some things that are happening across the world 2, 3 weeks, 4 weeks ahead of us. How do we reach out to them and learn from what they did or didn't do right? I'm not going to take blame. This isn't about finger pointing. I'm just going to say Italy's been hit hard. Are there some things that we can learn? And I know there's data coming out of some small communities in Italy that quarantined very rapidly, and others that were a little more not as responsive as fast, and they have very different incidence rates. So I think this construct of I'm being connected to people globally, and in our world today, it's sort of like I'll pick and choose who I want to connect with, and they're like me, therefore I'm going to connect with them. Right now, there's not a lot of segmentation going on. There's not a lot of, and I know there's a lot of issues we have, from race divide to gender divide. I get that, but guess what? Some of those things are being set aside, and we're coming in together and connecting on one thing. We're called humans, and we're being under attack by something that it's not. And I hope that is something that we can take with us. And I'm going through that a bit. I'm reaching out to, I've said to my kids, they're all teenagers, they can all drive, they're healthy. And I'm like, hey guys, we need to start reaching out to some of our older neighbors and knocking on their door, sending them a text and saying, hey, what do you need from the pharmacy? What do you need from the store? I said, we don't even have to go inside. Just set it at the door, knock, and walk away. I said, we can do that for our community. And it's something that, yeah, I might go over and help them out if I see them moving furniture or something, but we're not proactively do we just go across and say, hey, can I go get your groceries for you today? We're doing it today. And I don't know exactly how you would categorize that, but it feels like my community just got bigger.
I think you bring up a good piece that I've noticed too, is these times are scary. These times are, to a point, they can be isolating, but you also see people reaching out that, they're not associated with you, and yet they're reaching out to say, how can I help? Or you're reaching out, you're being proactive in this aspect. And if there is one thing that I, as a result of this, is that if we have that broader sense of community, we have that broader sense of who is in my tribe, right? The idea that this tribe is only these people that think and act and look like me, which is typically what we thinking about tribes, as opposed and saying, no, this tribe is really humans. We are a human race, and as such, we should be looking out for everybody. This is not us versus them. It is us versus that virus that is, potentially, going to take over and do a great deal of harm.
Well, I'll add one other piece to that, and we have some enabler today. If we go back to the Spanish flu 100 years ago, they didn't have the ability of doing what we're doing right now. They didn't have the ability to have LinkedIn, Instagram, WeChat, whatever those social connectivities that we have. We do have that today. So we can get the word out. We can connect with people in a way, even though we're in isolation, we can have these conversations. We can still pick up a phone. They didn't have that capability. And so we can change the course of history. While we can look back and say, how did they deal with it? Well, we can learn some things. I get that. But we can also communicate it much more rapidly. We can actually keep our body and minds and spirits uplifted. There's a group of us, there's about 8 of us that we've been connected for different topics unrelated to this. But I found during this time, we're still texting and group chatting and stuff of that nature. And there's a couple of them that are the individuals that are quite funny, and they're throwing out videos. And I said, keep doing that, because in this light of darkness, we need to have, or this time of darkness, we need some light shining through, and sometimes just some humor and some connectivity. Maybe you don't have to go and get out and pick up something for someone. Maybe you can actually call someone and say, how are you doing today?
Yeah.
Okay. And it can be that as simple. And that might be halfway around the globe. It might be your next door neighbor. It doesn't matter. We can distance. The social distancing is physical, but we have the ability to connect. And I think that technology is being leveraged today such that we'll set these differences aside. And by the way, these differences are real, and we do have some issues that have to be resolved. We all know that. Today's the time we come together and have a common battlefront, and we go, let's work on this together.
I love that you can frame this incredibly terrible and chaotic and treacherous disease in such positive light, James. It's inspiring. It really is. I really love that. So thanks for sharing your thoughts on that.
You're welcome. But I don't think there's a lot of original ideas I search, at least in my mind. I have to go and connect. But I read something that someone said, in these times of darkness, you have to face the sun and put the shadow behind you. And I love that analogy and that visual, because in the shadow is the darkness. Facing the sun puts a shadow behind you, and that's the path forward. So what do we have the opportunity to create a light for someone else? And by the way, when you actually give, there's a physiological benefit that we as individuals, when we connect and lift somebody else up, you yourself are being lifted up. And I'm not trying to be philosophical. I actually know that's a real experience, because I'm doing it right now with my neighbors, with my family. I'm reaching out to people that otherwise I wouldn't call up and say, can I go to the grocery store for you? And I have the capacity and I have the health to do that. So why am I not? I'll give you one other tactic. When I'm tipping generously, I usually tip, I think, pretty good, 20%. Wow, pat myself on the back. But in these times, when I'm carrying out, I'm tipping 60%, 100% of the bill. And the people are looking at me like, what are you doing? I'm like, we're in this together. I have a situation where I'm not at risk of losing my job tomorrow. They do. So transferring that over. And I love the fact that our governments are doing what they can, and let's continue to see that happen. But I'm not one of these people that just wait for the government to solve my problems. We're part of this government. We can help one another. And if that's maybe an uplifting journey to the store, or an extra $20 or an extra $100, and you have the means to do it, do it. So that's facing the sun and getting the shadow behind us.
Well, with that, I think that wraps this up. And thank you, James. We appreciate it. This is going to keep going on for a while, and hopefully we can live up to some of those uplifting things. And so that's our hope. And thank you, James, for sharing that with us and for being here.
Hey, it's great. I look forward to connecting with you guys again soon. Take care.
Welcome to the special edition of our grooving session, where Tim and I groove on some of the ideas and concepts that were inspired by our conversation with James Brewer. All right, Tim.
Yeah.
This was actually one of our first conversations in this.
Yeah.
It's not being published in the same order that we recorded these, but what did you take from this conversation with James?
Well, just props to James for being a guy who really sees his life. He frames his own life as a lifelong learning. Like life is learning for him. And I think that is something that we can all take away from us, right? So when he talked about how you can be wrong if you're open to changing your views, that it's okay to do that, because we can continue to shift, we continue to grow, we continue to learn. We can start with an idea, have new information introduced. This reminds me of Cal Turnbull. Mm-hmm. And then you end up with a new point of view, hopefully, right? With this new input of data and knowledge. And I love that he has this he's very comfortable with the idea of I can change. And we all change. And the thing is, we all change. We're always changing. And yet in our binary sense, we like to think, no, my self-identity is just mine. And
yeah.
I've been this way my whole life. You can't change me.
Yeah.
And of course, that's not true.
It's interesting. James and I have had the conversation before. He actually considers himself ignorant, and he thinks that's a good thing, because he said, I'm ignorant on a lot of things because I just haven't looked into them. I haven't studied them. I don't understand them. And as long as you're open, I love the idea that being ignorant isn't equated to being stupid. Being ignorant is actually just not knowing. And as long as you're open to learning from that, that's a great way of approaching this world and looking at, different things as they're coming in, because particularly again, in this time and age with the coronavirus and COVID-19 and all of the things that are coming in, we are all ignorant to a degree.
Right.
We are all in a state where we should be thinking about what can we learn and what can we throw away, because a lot of our beliefs that we have may be informed by something that isn't as relative as it should be to the current situation. And so we should all be thinking that we're ignorant, and we should all be open to learning from the experts and learning from the things that are going on.
Corporations, corporate leaders especially, are particularly adept at making big changes when these calamities occur. And I remember specifically being on a leadership team in 2008 and 2009 when the leadership team wanted to make some changes, but there wasn't really a hue and cry to do it. And then we have this huge panic with the financial crisis in those years, and it was a perfect opportunity to say, let's reset, let's change our true north and go after something. Let's change our tactics and our strategies and make changes to the organization at that time. And in some ways, it's easier to do it under these circumstances, and we could do that in our lives too. This is a great time to reset. And as you said, throw out the stuff that you don't like about yourself and adopt the new things that have kind of been in the back of your mind to say, I really kind of wanted to do this. And guess what? Now is the time to get started doing that.
Well, you brought up a really good point earlier where you talked about self-identity. And I think one of the things that gets in the way of us being able to change or to grow in these types of situations is that idea that our self-identity or even our social identity, it's fearful of being wrong, of changing that, right? It's scary for us to have our self-identity threatened. It's who we are. It's what we are. And oftentimes that self-identity gets muddled in with our beliefs and our ideas and what we make as public statements. So somebody says, this is a big hoax. Now they have to double down on that because it's a public statement that they have made. And that then is part of their social identity, which again relates to your self-identity. But I think that gets in the way of what James was talking about, which is this idea of being a constant learner in this and being able to change your viewpoints in the way that he did on this. And I think there's a couple things that we can think about as we're thinking about self-identity, right? So how do we shift? How do we shift with some of this? So one of the things, and again, we keep going back to Annie Duke on a lot of these things, but she has some really brilliant ideas out there. Yes. And one that I have adopted, I think for myself, even much more so since we've talked with her, is just this idea of thinking in probabilities.
Try to eliminate the binary thinking of yes, no, up, up, down, good, bad, all those kinds of things. Thinking more in terms of percentages, or she talks about thinking in bets.
Right. Thinking of, all right, I'm 95% sure that this is a hoax. Okay. Right. As opposed to saying, right, this is a damn hoax. But if you say this is a damn hoax, then you're solidified on that, and that becomes part of your identity, and it's harder to let go of that. Mm-hmm. If you say I'm 95% sure, then when new information comes in, you're just adjusting that percentage. So you're going, now I'm 80% sure.
Yeah.
Then more information comes in. Now I'm 50% sure.
That's a great way to save face.
It's a great way to save face. Now more information comes in and you can actually have your view changed. It's always this idea of saying, let's make sure that we are facing reality as opposed to trying to just be right. And that's a big thing.
That's a big statement right there. Oh. That's a really huge statement, because I like to say that we're much better at rationalizing than we are at being rational.
That's even a better statement, and a better statement.
Yeah.
It's true though. We tend to rationalize things away better than being rational about it in advance.
Yeah, but James is so good about talking about it's okay to be in a state of ignorance and to just make that a part of your self-identity, right? Make that a part of who you are, to say, I don't know everything about everything. So there's a whole bunch of things that I don't know about. And so I hear something from a messenger that I trust. I'm 70, 80% sure that that's likely to happen, but I'm not 100%.
Right, but you bring in a good point. It's if you can build that that element into who your self-identity, what your self-identity is, so that I am somebody who is ignorant and I need to learn or I want to learn.
Yeah.
That's a great part of that self-identity, because then being wrong isn't a threat to your self-identity. It's actually part of who your self-identity is, and you can build from that. So I think that's a great thing. Some other facets about this, though, is that the way that we get around that self-identity piece often is by having really poor memories or memories that shift and as need be. Right.
Right. Oh, yeah. Yes. Well, I don't have a video recorder.
That. Yeah, I never said that. I never believed that. What are you talking about? I would have never said that. And various different pieces like that.
I have a friend who says, I can't remember that. He doesn't say, I can't remember that. He says, oh, I can almost remember that.
I can almost remember that. That's good.
And I like that there's a little bit of a positive spin rather than, I don't remember saying that.
I can almost remember that.
I can almost remember that.
Well, and you mentioned messengers, right? And I think the other piece of this is when the talk and the points of view of society or your tribe start to shift, and messengers are a key part of that.
Yeah.
Then it's easier for us to shift as well, because then our social identity isn't one of being as opposed to the tribe that we're in. It is in alignment with that tribe, which means if I stick with my current beliefs, then my identity, my social identity is out of whack with the tribe that I've identified with. So that gives a big piece of this, which is why our leaders and the messages that they send in times like this are so important.
Yeah, very important.
And, we can debate whether or not they've been good or not, but that's a whole separate conversation. So,
well, there's a couple things that get blended in my mind from conversations that we've had with other guests just in the past 48 hours, right? Is learn how to think on your own. Study history,
history.
Go back and look at history and understand what's going on for yourself, and then think on your own.
Yeah.
Right. Like draw conclusions yourself so that you're actually doing the critical thinking. You're engaging that system 2 thinking to say, what could this be? And of course, we don't have the brain power to do it on everything. But if you're going to make decisions about your own life, about how you're going to process something or make a big stand, do the thinking on your own. Take time to give it some thought.
What did Christian Hunt say? It's like, don't outsource your critical thinking.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I loved that line. Don't outsource your critical thinking, because it's so easy to do. Or Barry Ritholtz, when he talked about, the fallacy, the narrative fallacy, and, don't fall for the simple story.
Yeah.
Right. Make sure you look back and look at that history, because this isn't 100-year flood from a financial market perspective. We do this every 10 years. So look back at that history, start planning for the future, and run with that. So those are good. What else?
Well, Laurie Santos would say our brains are trying to lie to us all the time. So you got to question that. How about this idea that unintended consequences happen? Right, when something monstrous like this comes into our world and they shut down the service industry, of course, the ripple effects are extensive. And James did a great job of playing this out with how people get impacted by one major decision.
Yeah.
But this unintended consequences side, that there is data saying that there's less influenza A because of social distancing and hand washing.
Yeah. So
who could have anticipated
that's a positive. That's a positive. I mean, you could have, but we don't, right? We don't necessarily think of those when we're putting a policy in place or we're changing something. We're looking at the direct impact that usually has, without, as James talked about, the ripples. And the ripples, I think, are really important as we go through these things.
They are.
And so understanding how those ripples impact others and other things is part of this unintended consequence. The positive impact of all of this is fewer people are getting sick from the common flu. Fewer people are going to die from the common flu because we're keeping them safe, because we wash our hands and social distancing and all of, we don't touch our face, right? So those are good things, right? there are unintended consequences from businesses. You can predict that certain businesses are that the economy is going to tank. But there are some businesses that in this time are probably going to do well.
Right.
And again, maybe those aren't unintended, but Zoom, from what I understand, is just it's taken off in the past week. You have all the streaming services, Amazon, Target, I think, are doing delivery services. All of those are still doing well. And granted, that may not be unintended, but it's a ripple from this action that is contrary to the main theme of everything else that is going on.
And right? What about learning new skills? We are really figuring out how to use, we're being pushed into a new level of technology, A, because it's available, but B, because we kind of have to in order to stay socially connected. Physical distancing, but social connection.
Yeah. I think all of those things are happening. And, some of them are positive. Lots and lots and lots of them are negative.
Right.
But to that degree, James was pretty hopeful about some of the long-term consequences that this could have.
I like his optimism.
I'm not sure if I fully am in alignment with that optimism. There's a Pollyanna kind of thing of everybody coming together and singing Kumbaya. Yeah. That I don't think is necessarily what is happening, nor is it a potential outcome of this either. It could be. I hope it could happen. If we work at it, we may be able to make it more likely.
Yeah, let's think about it in terms of percentages, not so much in absolutes, right?
Yeah.
So it's not like the world is going to become better, but it's to the degree that we might improve some aspects of our lives. Yeah. And part of it could be this being more collaborative. I think that could really become a powerful factor in the way that we do our social groups and the way that we do our work groups. Collaboration could be something that we value just a bit more than we do today.
And I hope that's the case. I'm 30% sure that it probably won't have a big impact.
And
I'm open to that percentage being changed up or down. I'm hoping it will be changed up.
Well said. All
right. Thank you for listening to the special episode of Behavioral Grooves. We hope that you found it interesting and insightful. If you liked it, please let others know. We think that the topic is important, and maybe we can help in educating people about how behavioral science can help us all out in this current craziness that we are going through.
Also, please let us know if you have any thoughts or ideas that would be helpful or that we could share. You can reach us through the Connect tab on the Behavioral Grooves website at www.behavioralgrooves.com or through Twitter. I'm at @THoulahan and Kurt is @WhatMotivates. We really do love hearing from you, and this topic is one that spurs lots of emotions and thought.
As part of our mission, we want to expand and inform the community of people who think about positively applying behavioral science to life. One way that happens is through leaving reviews. If you think this podcast is beneficial and should grow, we would really appreciate to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or whichever podcast server you use.
It only takes a few minutes and goes a long way to boost us in the algorithms that are used to generate search results.
Also, please check out the show notes. We are linking to a number of resources, articles, podcasts, newsletters that we vetted to bring good facts and ideas around COVID-19 and the coronavirus, its impact, and ways that we can help slow down the spread. There is a lot of information that's being pushed out to everyone each day, and we are weeding through it to find good stuff so that you don't have to.
We truly appreciate you listening. Now go out and wash your hands.